Last Sunday, you made me so happy. It was Pastor Appreciation Sunday. I went back to my $18 million condo that you had provided for me. That was beautiful. It's $18 million view, I mean. And it's a beautiful place. And I sat there with the cards that you had sent me. Thank you so much for those beautiful cards. I read them. You're so kind and so good to me. I appreciate it beyond belief. I send the appreciation back to you. Been happy to serve as this interim in between Pastor Michael Bastian and the new pastor, whomever that will be. This is an exciting time, and I'm so glad I've been a part of it. Thank you again and again for your gifts and cards. They mean a great deal to us. So I do appreciate you right back, okay? Okay. What an odd lesson. Heather had a great stab at it. I'm telling you, she nailed it. It's the funniest story in a way. It's about James and John. Who were they? Remember, they're disciples. They were the sons of Zebedee. They were a fishing family. And Jesus came to the lake and said, "Follow me." And James and John followed him. James would have been the older brother. And they were off to be disciples. And this particular lesson today is about almost the whole journey, 2/3 at least into the journey of Christ to the cross. And James and John, they know him. They want to be his favorites. Say, "We would like to be either on the right or the left hand when you come into your kingdom." And so Jesus said, "No, I can't do that. First of all, it's not mine to give," meaning the Father gives that. And then he says this very kind of a come to Jesus moment saying, "Can you drink the cup of suffering? Can you be baptized with the baptism I've been given?" These are all references to the cross. They would not have had any. What are you talking about, the cup of suffering? What are you talking about, the baptism that you've had? It's a baptism, it's a suffering that will finally come true on the evening of Thursday after he's been betrayed. Remember, he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, and who does he ask to be with? Who? He asks that James and John and Peter, our James and John and Peter, be with him, and they fall asleep. They miss that cup of suffering. They don't understand it until the next day when they watch him on the cross. It's a very powerful story, and it's so easy, these come to Jesus moments, that we sometimes miss their importance. I'm sure everyone in this room has had some kind of come to Jesus moment. It doesn't have to be something you dread. It doesn't have to be a rebuke. It doesn't have to be that strong arm of Jesus. Can you drink my cup of suffering? And sometimes it's for those of you who've had health issues. It is a kind of come to Jesus moment. You're at that moment where you're waiting to hear from a doctor about a test, how agonizing that is, if that's where you are. There are some who are watching their very families fall apart, some kind of a structure in the unit itself. What's wrong? Why is my family always so unhappy? Sometimes it's a marriage issue. Sometimes it's financial. I was just at a symposium recently, and the teacher was talking about, you have no idea how many people in your church are in deep credit card trouble. Or you have no idea how many in your church are dealing with some kind of addiction, if not their own, somebody else's. And we all need, if you will, this kind of come to Jesus moment, particularly when it brings healing and health. I have kind of a humorous story about come to Jesus moment. It happened in my uncle Luther Youngdahl's life. Uncle Luther was the governor of Minnesota, and he was going for his second term. Yes, I come from royalty. Yes, yes. And he was out on the Chippewa reservation, and he was looking for votes, and he was stumping, campaign, and got up on the podium, and he started talking, "I'm going to reduce your taxes," and he heard a spontaneous Mangumba, and "I'm going to make sure your kids have great schools," Mangumba, and on it went, and he was, boy, this is really working. Finally, he was finished, and the chief said, "Would you like to look around at the reservation, see some?" "Yeah, absolutely." "Now, let's go look at the stables." They walked over, and the chief said, "Careful, Governor, you're going to step in the Mangumba." There it is. That's 70 years ago he used to tell that story about himself. That's probably all you're going to remember is Pastor talking about Mangumba the whole time. It is a kind of come to Jesus moment for him, and he realized that in some ways he had to tone it down a bit about his promises. But most of the come to Jesus moments that matter the deepest and are the most important to us when that come to Jesus moment is about hope. And if you're searching for hope in your life today, whatever that is, There's so many wonderful stories that bind us together. It's what James and John ultimately found in their lives with the power of Christ. Now, some of you are new to this area. You may never have heard of the name of Jimmy Santiago Baca. Jimmy Santiago Baca. But those who have lived here, I think you've heard of it. Perhaps you've read some of his things. It's a remarkable story. Jimmy grew up in Santa Fe in the 50s, and by the age of 2, his parents had already just disappeared. He was raised by all kinds of different people. By the age of 13, he was into drugs, he was into violence. He lived on the streets here in Albuquerque and later in Arizona. And he found himself in Florence, Arizona for a 4-year prison term for drugs and distribution of drugs. He was very violent, and 2 of those 4 years he spent in solitary because of the violence around him, to him, and that he was also giving to others. He said he walked in with about that much of soul in himself. And he said it was just awful. It was a nightmare every day, every night. And during the time that he was in solitary confinement, often they would even put him in the death row cell with the worst of the worsts. And in a moment of, he didn't even know why, he stole somebody's book. How silly, he stole a book, put it under his arm, brought it back to his cell. And he opened up the book and he realized, I don't know how to read. I don't know how to read. I don't even know how to get somebody to help me to read. He saw 3 words, dog he figured out, sheep he figured out, and the word look, like look with your eyes. And that's all he knew. That's all he could figure out. And he started to ask a couple of people, could you help me read? And one of them was a triple murder suspect, a guy in for 3 murders. He helped him read, and he got this strange letter one day from a well-meaning Christian in the community. Said, I'm so-and-so, I go to so-and-so church, and we have a list of people that might enjoy a letter. I don't know who you are, but if you want to have a pen pal, I'm happy. And he had that translated by somebody who could read, and he began to write, and he didn't even know how to write anything. And his writing were just words that would jump out at him. He understood words, but he couldn't put anything into a sentence. And then that friend said, why don't you try to do poetry? He didn't even know what that was. And you probably know the rest of the story. He began to do this beautiful poetry coming out of the dark places of that Florence, Arizona prison. From stealing a book to becoming a great poet. And today, as he was released, and he's a new man, and he has surrendered his life to the Lord, all of this. And today, what does he do with his life? He goes to the prison and teaches others how to write and how to read and how to do poetry. That's a real come to Jesus moment, an extraordinary moment. Jimmy Santiago Baca, good thing for you to do, to look at the internet also and read about him. I also want you to understand that when these moments come from Christ, they're not always just Jesus moments, but it's the whole Spirit of Christ within. Our confirmation class is studying now the Lord's Prayer, and those words give us today our daily bread. It's a simple line. Daily bread from God. Okay, great. Well, we started exploring. It comes from, the basis of it is the 16th chapter of Exodus. Write that down. Go home and read that in your Bibles, okay? Or look it up on the internet. It's a beautiful, beautiful time in which the Israelites have passed through the Red Sea. The Egyptians are behind them, and no longer are they a part of their lives. They're free, but they're in the wilderness. And you remember what happens? They begin to murmur, murmur, murmur. What are they murmuring? What are they complaining about? Well, they have freedom, but no food. And they say, we have no meat and we have no bread. And Moses takes it to the Lord. I don't know how any of this happened. Moses goes to the Lord. We have no meat, we have no bread. They're murmuring. And said, tomorrow you will have meat in the evening and you will have bread in the morning. All right, okay. So that evening they find a dwelling, a clearing in the wilderness. And there are doves and quail that have come, and they're able to capture them. And they have meat. And in the morning, you remember what happened. It's a frost-like substance. Nobody can quite understand. It's called manna. That's manna. And the word from the Lord is, take enough for one day, for you and your family. And they're out there, and they're putting it together, and it kind of forms a little piece of cake. Everyone's afraid to eat it. And they eat it, and it tastes like what? It tastes like honey. Honey. And it sustains them. And he said, when the Sabbath comes, that would be, of course, Saturday, Friday night, when the Sabbath comes, make sure you take enough for 2 days, because that will not spoil. And so each day they have enough for themselves, and then comes the Sabbath, they take extra, and sure enough, it doesn't spoil. It's this beautiful story of this coming to understand the great mystery of faith, the great mystery of hope that comes to God in your wilderness moments. And if you're experiencing a wilderness moment this morning, whatever it is, little or large, just know that that hope is there. That hope is sustained through the power of God's love for us. And one of the things about Jewish piety that I've always loved and I've never understood is that mournful murmuring melody of the Kaddish. That's that ancient prayer. Perhaps you've heard it at funerals. Perhaps you've heard it, if you've ever seen a movie about the Holocaust, where they're singing the Kaddish at these deeply terrible times. This prayer of deep soul searching and asking God for help and hope. And I once asked a rabbi, I love the prayer, and I think I know about the words, but what does God say to this prayer? What do the people of God believe that God is saying back to us? And he said, well, God says, I'll give you another day. I said, is that it? And he looked at me like, you're so dumb. Is that it? I'll give you another day? And the rabbi said, what more do you want? I'll give you another day. I'll give you another day for you to help yourself, for me to help you further. I'll give you another day. The power of that moment. I love this text. I love this about James and John and the power of James and John in their ministries that abounded. And I also like the fact that we have been given this opportunity to give to others, to share this great energy of James and Jesus with others. I have a bishop friend in California, and he tells a story about himself that he was at an installation for a pastor, and he was very excited. It was in Oakland. Some of you know where Oakland and San Francisco. Oakland is East Bay, and there are sections of Oakland that are just so stunningly beautiful, but they're tough areas too, like all cities. Tough little areas there's a lot of poverty. Well, this is where that church was. And the installation in the church was for this young new pastor. He'd been there for about 2 or 3 months, and he was just starting. And the building was such that there was the office where the bishop was, and the bishop found himself primping in front of a mirror, making sure his robes are all set as he installs this poor young pastor, a sheep for the fold, okay? And there's a door back there, and then there's a door that leads out into the basement where the luncheon is going to be after the service. And then upstairs was the church. And the bishop's getting ready, and the bishop hears somebody knocking on the door. And he didn't know what to do. And then just then the pastor comes through this door. He's out of breath, Okay, getting ready. And the bishop says, well, somebody was knocking on the door. The door is out, leads to the street. And he goes over the pastor. And he sees this guy shivering. He sees this guy trembling. He sees this guy just a mess. He's in rags. He's just a mess. He said, do you have any food? And the pastor says, come right in. He closes the door. This is our bishop. The poor bishop didn't know what to do. This is our bishop. And the bishop said, I hope he doesn't ask me for any food. Anyway, this is the bishop. And he said, right through this door. And we're going to have lunch in a while, but you're going to have lunch right now. I'll make sure you get it. And then he said to the man, this is where the trembling stops. This is where it stops. His way of saying to this man, you're beginning now on a new adventure. You're coming out of the wilderness. There is manna for you. The bishop said he never in his ministry seen anything quite like it. I want to go back for just a postscript. James in Spanish is Santiago. Did you know that? James is Santiago. Remember Jimmy Santiago? It'd be Jimmy James Baca. James, it's believed that after Christ died, the disciples were dispersed. James took all the way to the end of the Mediterranean Sea, and there he went to Spain. And there's something called the Camino de Santiago. It's the way of Santiago. It's the way of James. It's how James took that and converted many, many people in Spain to the mystery of Christ. And then in about 42 AD, that's about 9 years after Christ's death, James came back to Jerusalem, came back to see the rest of the disciples, and it was there he was beheaded by Herod. He became the first disciple to be martyred. Wait a minute. Be on my right hand, be on my left hand. I want my brother with me at one moment, and 9 or 10 years later, he gives up his life to become a martyr. That voyage of Santiago. And by the way, you can take that voyage if you wish. It's kind of on my, it's on my bucket list, but it's way down at the bottom. I don't know how to make it happen. 500-mile walk across much of northern Spain into France, and there you can go by the church where the remains of James are. It's a pilgrimage, and James became known as the patron of pilgrims. You got any pilgrim energy in you, James is your person, who in the one moment thought he wanted glory and found it. How did he find it? By following Christ, by giving to others. That's how we become disciples of the Lord. Now let's think about these things as we prepare to receive this remarkable gift given by our Lord, the gift of the sacrament, and ask the blessings from Christ for all of us. Amen. Amen.